Let's hear it again for Rihanna. Thank you. So this month we're exploring the practice of crossing thresholds. And it is based on the book The Way of the Pilgrim, which is in the bookstore by Christine Valters Paintner. So the threshold, as we talked about last week, is that in-between place where we can be the most creative. It can also be the most difficult place to be. The analogy that I used last week, and I want to kind of stay with it for a couple of weeks, is that of the caterpillar, that when it's in the cocoon, it digests itself and it turns into goo. Remember that from last week, the caterpillar goo? And while it's goo, there is still something called an imaginal disc or imaginal cells that hold the blueprint and that hold the image for the butterfly. So it holds the image of the wings, it holds the image of the eyes, of the antenna, of the entire body of the butterfly as it goes through this process. So what looks like goo is actually this reforming into something beautiful. And in the same way that when we're in a transition place, we know that the imaginal disc or the imaginal cells hold the blueprint for our wings and for our next step in life, yeah? So if you want to delve into this more deeply, then I invite you to come to the class on Wednesday night, Finding Yourself in Transition. If anybody's in that in-between place, it's helpful to have a support group who can share stories and experiences with you at the same time. So one of the things that I'm inviting us to engage in this month is to notice doorways, to notice windows, to notice all the physical thresholds that you cross. And what I would like you to do is to photograph them. Now, we all have our phones with us, right? So we always have a camera. So begin to notice the different doorways. And I'd like you to photograph them and then send them to us. And then we're going to include them in the service. And it opens our minds to beginning to see these things. Now in Judaism, that's a practice already with the mezuzah, right? The mezuzah holds the scripture from the Torah in blessing the house, and you can put one at the door, and you can put one at each doorway in the house. Now, doorways are fascinating if you really think about it, because for a while I was like, really, I'm going to do 3 weeks on doorways and thresholds and whoa. But I was thinking about when I was in England a few years ago, and I was taking a course at Exeter College, and I had the address, but I couldn't find it. Not that that's anything new, because I have a struggle finding things anyway with addresses, but I had the GPS, and it led me to this place, which it was supposed to be Exeter College, but instead there was this huge, door frame, just this huge. It was not as big as the wall, but maybe half the size. And then I was like, okay, so, and then there was an outline of a door, a giant door. But I was like, well, where's the doorknob? I couldn't, how do you get in? And I was with a friend of mine who just kept pushing along the door, and all of a sudden there was a door that was inside the door, like if we were to put a door here, and then he just pushed, and we walked into this incredible courtyard, and there's another threshold with this beautiful scene, and it was actually, the garden was so magical, and it was actually where Tolkien came up with his Lord of the Rings view when he was living there and going to school there. And what I noticed too in England was how elaborate all the thresholds were, all the archways, just down in the street or just walking into an apartment building. And of course, some of them, they're ancient because it's old, and hundreds of years old. And they're just these amazing thresholds. And it feels like when you're walking through it that you're actually passing from one consciousness or one place to another that's just beyond the physical, right? And that's the idea that I want us to hold as we move through the thresholds. So the word mezuzah actually means doorway. And again, it's a piece of parchment that's in a decorative case, and there's very strict rules about how you attach one to a doorway. Has to be at the top third, has to be slanted in just a bit. And one of the prayers on it is, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us with his mitzvah and commanded us to affix a mezuzah." Now, the mezuzah harkens back to the Passover, which is the season that we're in right now. And as you remember, in the Passover, there were all the plagues, and the last plague was the angel of death was going to come over Egypt. And so God told the Israelites to put lamb's blood over the doorposts, and it would be a sign to pass over. So it's kind of a hearkening back to that. On the website aish.com, it says, "Having a mezuzah on each room means that whenever we move from one domain or one sphere of activity to another, we must renew our consciousness of God's presence and act in a way that sanctifies his name. The mezuzah is there to keep away evil spirits, not those that float around like the figments of Hollywood's imagination, but those that we can control inside our doors and inside our hearts." So it's a spiritual practice, isn't it? It's a spiritual practice to kiss it, to touch it, to remind us that as we go from one place to another, from one activity to another, to one room to another, to bring God's presence into that. So for me, as we move into this place, it's helpful for me to hear stories of other people who have been in the threshold. And I know we've all been in the threshold, the liminal space, the place where you've let go and you haven't quite stepped into the thing that's next and you're kind of hanging out there. So I was kind of researching and looking at different stories, and I came across Paul McCartney, of all people. And if you remember, the Beatles, that when the Beatles broke up, part of the reason they broke up is that the three Beatles had hired Klein to be their manager, and Paul McCartney, Alan Klein, to be their manager, and Paul McCartney didn't want him as his manager. So the only way out of it was for him to sue the other three so that he could break the business contract with him. And that sounds easy, but it was devastating. It was absolutely devastating. And here he is, a Beatle, and then he no longer is a Beatle. What is he? I mean, imagine that. And he said, I was breaking from my lifelong friends. And we were growing up, we were getting married, we lived separately. And I did not know whether I was going to continue in music. He hit such a low and such a depression after the Beatles broke up because he was in the in-between place, right? He'd let go of one thing, hadn't yet gone into another, was in the place of goo. It's like, where am I? What am I? And so he and his family moved to a small house in Scotland, and he started drinking. Not just a little bit, but he started drinking every day. As soon as he got up in the morning, he started drinking. And he said, at first it was fun, but then it started to become a problem. And his wife finally told him that he had to get his act together, that he had a family, that he had a life, he needed to move forward, and he had to step out of the goo in a sense. And then he said that he liked the idea of a band. He could have gone with Eric Clapton or done a super band, but he said, I wanted to go back to square one and start over again. And he said, the truth is, we were terrible. We were absolutely terrible. His wife was the pianist, and she couldn't play and had to learn. And he said, we ended up playing at universities and graduations and town halls. And he said, I was at Shea Stadium, and now here I am, in the town hall singing, playing for a graduation. And he said, you had to hold your nerve, but then you do in life. And what came out of this is, again, if we hold that image of the caterpillar, he may have been in the goo, but the whole time, the imaginal disc, the imaginal cells, the imaginal blueprint was there and holding that for him, yeah? And so he walked through the doorway of tomorrow and he entered into the next phase of his life. Was it easy? No, it was very difficult. Is it easy for any of us? Sometimes it is. So my question to you is, what is your doorway of tomorrow, right? What is the next phase of your life that you are being called to right now? And how can you step into that? And we're going to be, again, looking at that as we move forward. Because the truth is, we're all divine beings. We have the Spirit of God, that divine spark that's within us. And that is what is the part of the blueprint, right? It's part of that imaginal realm that we're in. That no matter what's happening in our life, that there's something bigger, there's something higher, there's something stronger that's within us that's calling us out of where we are. So I'm kind of in a Hollywood storytelling mode today, so you're going to hear another one. And it's because, I mean, they're so public that it's easy to see their threshold experiences, isn't it? And so the other person I want to talk about is Sylvester Stallone, right? Yep. So when he was a kid, he had a really rough time. It wasn't an easy life. And I think when he was born, the forceps paralyzed part of his face or something, which is why his face is a little strange. And he said that all he ever wanted to do since he was little was be in the movies. That's the only thing he ever wanted to do. Now, because of the way he talked, every time he would go for a job interview, he sounded stupid, so nobody would hire him. And he just, nothing was working, and he ended up homeless. And he had a dog with him that he loved, his dog Butkus. It was like a bulldog kind of a dog. And he loved this dog. And he was homeless, and he was so broke that he couldn't afford to feed the dog. And so he said he stood outside of a liquor store and waited for people to come out, and he ended up selling his dog for $50. He said it about broke his heart. And then, but again, so he's in the goo, right? You're really in the goo, and he's really in the goo. And yet, the doorway of tomorrow is calling to him, right? He still has that blueprint there. And he said, he needed to make movies or be in movies or write movies. And he said it was either do that or rob somebody. He said, because I was at the end, I was at the very end of my rope. And so in 1975, he went to a fight and he saw Muhammad Ali fight Webner. Yeah, Webner. And it inspired him to write a screenplay. So literally for 20 hours straight, in 3 days, but yeah, for 20 hours straight, he did nothing but write Rocky. He wrote this screenplay. And it was so good that when he went to try to sell it, they're like, we'll give you $125,000 for that. Now, this is the 70s. That's a lot of money. And when you're homeless, it's a fortune, right? And he says, okay, but I want to star in it. And it's like, really? What have you been in? Not much. So they said, nope, we want Burt Reynolds, we want somebody like that. And he said, no. So a few weeks later, they came back and they said, all right, we'll give you $325,000, and we're still not letting you star in it. And again, he said no. And so finally, they came back to him and they said, all right, you can be in the movie, but we're only going to pay you $35,000. And he said, that's fine. And the first thing he did with the $35,000 is he bought his dog back. And he paid $3,000 for his dog. And if you remember the Rocky movie, there's a dog in it, and that's Butkus. That's his dog. He brought his dog into the movie. Rocky ended up being nominated for 10 Academy Awards. It won Best Picture. He was nominated for Best Actor, for Best Screenwriter. Now, the truth is that when we're in the goo and we're coming out of it, it doesn't mean that we're going to get nominated for Academy Awards and we're going to hit the jackpot and all these wonderful things are going to happen. What it does mean is that we're going to step into the next phase of our lives. And again, if we hold to that blueprint, it's like, what is your purpose? What is that for you, for each one of us? Because it doesn't always necessarily translate into material recognition and success, does it? But what it does do is it feeds our soul and it uplifts everyone, ourselves and everyone else around us, right, as we move into that place. Again, we are divine beings and we are not limited by our circumstances. We have the blueprint of the Christ, the blueprint of the divine within us, and this leads us to a call and a purpose that benefits all beings. Now, there are thresholds in our personal lives, but I also think that there are thresholds culturally, nationally, and globally. And this week marked the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, who invited us to walk through the doorway of tomorrow through the practice of nonviolence, right, and equality. He was so interested and dedicated to nonviolence that he went to India for 5 weeks, and he met with Gandhi's family to just talk with them about how does this work. And he saw a lot of similarities between the British Empire and the Indians and what was going on in the United States. HBO has a documentary out right now called King in the Wilderness. And if you think about it, the threshold, the liminal space is the wilderness, is it not? It is the wilderness. And the documentary focuses on the last 3 years of his life. And it was a very discouraging time for him. An article that reviewed the film said much of what happened afterward during the last 3 years of his life is rarely discussed. But it was a time when Dr. King said his dream had turned into a nightmare. From the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to his assassination in 68, he remained unshakably committed to nonviolence in the face of an increasingly unstable country. So he took on poverty, he took on equality, he took on all through nonviolence, and then he spoke out against the war. And if you read that letter, it's amazing. And yet he alienated so many people at the time when he did that, including Lyndon Johnson, who was like this, great supporter of civil rights. There's an interesting piece in the film where he's on a march, and there's a guy from TV with a camera and the microphone, and on one side is King and the other side is Stokely Carmichael, and he's interviewing King about nonviolence, and he's saying, I'm dedicated to this, and then he interviews Stokely Carmichael, and they're all walking, and he says, well, I don't think it's working, I don't think nonviolence is working, I think we need to move in another direction, and then he'd go back to King, and it was really interesting to see it kind of go back and forth. The day that he left for Memphis, his kids, his boys, did not want him to go. They were saying, Daddy, don't go at breakfast. And when he got in the car, his boys jumped on the hood of the car. They jumped on the hood of the car and they're going, Daddy, don't go, almost as if they had a premonition. And, he said to the person who was in the car with him, I think I need to back off of some of the things that I'm doing, and I need to devote more time to my family and stay home a little more. What's interesting about the speech that he gave the night before he was killed in Memphis, because it's that famous speech where he says, I may not get to them, I have seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, and what's interesting about that talk is when he got to Memphis, things just seemed kind of off, it just wasn't working, and he decided not to go to the church that night, and he sent somebody else to speak for him. And so when his protege went and saw the crowd, he calls Dr. King at the hotel and he said, you need to come down here because people are wanting to hear you, they're wanting to see you. And he says, I'm already in my pajamas and I'm already in bed. And the guy's like, yeah. And he goes, so you want me to get dressed and you want me to go down there and you want me to speak? And he goes, yes, I do. And he did, and he gave that incredible speech. That is, I just think about, boy, how do you go from just I'm hanging out in my hotel room to boom, just giving that incredible speech and just changing life. I believe that Dr. King has held and continues to hold the imaginal disk, the imaginal cells, if you will, for humanity, right? Because to live in a world of nonviolence and peace is still something we are seeking, and his words are as true today as they were when he spoke them years ago. I mean, it's astounding. And so you can see him holding this blueprint, right? You can see him holding it not just for himself, but he's holding it for the world. He's holding it for humanity. And it's that doorway of tomorrow in which we all need to cross. Yeah? So sometimes we're doing it for ourselves, and sometimes we're doing it for the benefit of all beings. When Jesus said, ask, seek, knock, and find, again, we get the image of the doorway. We get that image of prayer. And when I hear the words knock, I get this feeling of repetitiveness, right? And so we move into, we're not alone. We're not alone on this journey. We're not alone as we are in the liminal goo realm that we may be in, as we step in from one threshold to another into the doorway of tomorrow. We are not alone. We have, again, that presence of God within us, but we also, as Jesus encouraged us to ask, seek, and knock and find, to reach out and ask for help. As we move more into this process, I would like for us, not today, but in the next weeks, to call on our ancestors, to call on our angels, to call on our guides to help us as we walk from one to another. So, what is it that you need to ask for? And what assistance do you need in order to cross the threshold? So we're going to close with a prayer of seeking that truth that's within us. So I invite you just to turn your attention within for a moment. And I'd like you to imagine a threshold, a doorway in front of you. What is your doorway to tomorrow? Just imagine that you can peek through and you can see it. What is the vision of your doorway of tomorrow? Another way of asking it is, what is the next phase of your life? And what is the blueprint that is being held for you? What is that divine idea that exists in you that is seeking its full expression, that you break out of it like a caterpillar breaks out of the cocoon or the butterfly breaks out of the cocoon? And so we recognize that we are not alone. And so we ask, we seek, we knock, and we find. And I invite you in your imagination to step through this doorway into your full Christedness, into your full divine light. For you cannot be contained. And for this awareness, and in the name and through the power of the living Spirit of truth, we say thank you and amen.